So we are going to talk about the grow today. Hopefully yesterday should have given you a good idea of what a successful setup should look like for you. And now we're going to talk about actually growing the plant itself. Early on, I mentioned yesterday that the setup that we're talking about is a indoor horticultural setup that would work with pretty much any plant. Today, I'm going to talk about things, principles that and strategies that are specific to the cannabis plant. So, this is probably going to be the most specific download you're going to get. I'm going to try to go through really slow, but as always, please don't hesitate to drop comments, drop questions in the chat, and I'm going to do my best to end a little bit earlier on the slides today so that we have a little bit more time for Q&A, because I know I didn't get to all of our questions last time. I'm going to also explore, jump in, Josh, if this is a terrible idea, but explore maybe people coming on mic and asking questions verbally at designated points. It would be great to hear some voices today if we have the time. Okay, sounds good. So we're going to talk about the life cycle of the cannabis plant. If you remember from our last class, we talked about setting up a grow environment inside your home. We talked a little bit about outdoor cultivation, but again, we're going to sort of focus on indoor because it's the thing that most people are going to be able to do. And then we'll have a little bonus content for growing outdoors today before the sun sets. The life cycle of a cannabis plant is broadly defined as our seedling stage, our vegetative stage, and our flowering stage. The seedling stage, each one has the plant prefers slightly different environmental conditions. The plant prefers different nutrient regimens, and there are different techniques that you're going to implement as a grower at each one of these stages to maximize the plant's ability to produce flowers and cannabinoids, which, as I described yesterday, are part of those flowers. They are contained within structures on those flowers called trichomes. So we're trying to set up our plant for success so that it has the most energy and the least stress, so that it can produce up to its genetic potential. If you're getting seeds, as we discussed yesterday, from a reputable seed bank and breeders that, kind of know what they're doing, there's a very good chance that the seeds you get are going to be capable of incredible things. They're going to be genetically really powerful, and the limiting factor, especially in your first few attempts growing, you're going to actually limit the plant's ability to express itself fully by, mistakes you might inevitably make that will prevent the plant from fully living up to its genetic potential. When you do get a system of growing dialed in really well, then you might want to start thinking about, are these the most elite genetics ever? But chances are, especially your first few runs, your quality is not going to be limited by genetics as much as your ability to grow some really good genetics. We're going to start with the seedling stage. As I mentioned, my recommendation for starting seeds is in Rapid Rooter or Root Riot peat plugs. They're like little spongy cubes that are pretty inexpensive at a grocery store off of Amazon, that you can start cannabis seeds in. Usually they'll come with a tray, and you'll place your seed in there's already a pre-designated hole. Just put the seed in the hole, rip off a little corner of the peat plug and seal it up a little bit. That process begins germination. Germination is when the seed develops a taproot, which is just one little white root in the cannabis plant, that root, that tap root coming out of the seed is the principal root, sort of like the trunk of the roots. And then the other roots will split off of it, sort of in a branching pattern. We talk a lot about as above, so below, and fractals for those of you who are just in those things. These roots obviously are very beautiful and very fascinating. But that central taproot is actually going to anchor the plant's root system. So that taproot is very important. Some people recommend starting seeds in a warm paper towel, keeping a paper towel moist and putting it somewhere warm, like on top of your fridge. And then with tweezers, taking that sprouted seed and putting it in a small container of seedling mix, so a light soil mix. I don't recommend that because it just feels like extra steps to me, and I don't think it's optimal for the roots to develop. These peat plugs are pretty much engineered to nurture cannabis roots, and it's very hard to drown them by overwatering them or let them dry out, because it's very sort of obvious and intuitive when the peat starter plug is wet and when it's dry. So I definitely recommend those. The other thing I would recommend, other than starting your seeds in a peat plug, is to go directly into a small container. Like I said, a red solo cup, a party cup is a great size. That's what most people do, believe it or not. Even in commercial settings, they literally use plastic solo cups and they punch holes in the bottom just because, for whatever reason, the shape, the size, everything just happens to work really well for starting cannabis seeds. The way you start a seed in a small container is you'll moisten the soil, not soaking wet, but pretty evenly wet. And then you plant the seed 1/4 inch deep, cover it up with soil, and mist it regularly to keep the surface of the soil moist around where the seed is until it germinates. That can take anywhere between, I've seen seeds germinate as quickly as 48 hours. Sometimes they take, 4, even 7 days. And there are some weird little dud seeds that could take longer, but generally between, 2 to 7 days, you'll see germination, depending on how fresh the seeds are. If those seeds were produced recent, like in the previous calendar year, they should germinate pretty quickly. If they've been sitting around for a while, they might take longer to germinate, as I think is similar with vegetables. In the seedling stage, whether you're in your peat plug or in your small container, or you've achieved germination in the peat plug and you've transplanted into the small container, you're going to want a very humid and warm environment. There is a range, and this isn't super precise, so I would definitely recommend everybody do a little bit of research on ideal humidity and temperature for their seedlings. But I like to keep my seedlings at around 60 to 70% humidity, at as high as 80%, 60 to 80% relative humidity. I like to keep them fairly warm, in the, as far, I would say, no cooler than room temperature, no cooler than 72 degrees. If you can get 80, if you can achieve 80 degrees and still have, the proper level of humidity, then try to hit 80. So humid, warm is good for seedlings, as well as I think pretty much seedlings of any species. And then for light, you're not going to want an extremely strong light at this point, but you don't want a light that is so weak that the plant will be reaching for light. A common mistake people make is they don't use enough light around the time of germination. For example, if they put it on a windowsill or under like a really cheapo LED, and because that seedling is hungry for light, it's reaching for light, it'll get really leggy. So it'll shoot up a very long floppy stem because it's trying to get closer to the light. And the danger with that is it can then flop over. So once you get germination, once the green leaves appear above the soil level, you're going to want to make sure the plant is supplied with enough light. There's no one size fits all. It depends on what kind of light you have. But a good sort of rule of thumb would be like one of those fluorescent tube lights or compact fluorescent bulbs, or an LED equivalent of those kinds of fluorescent bulbs. You can drop them pretty close to the leaves of that light. And the plant will stay kind of robust and stocky. If you see the stems elongating and the plant looks like it's reaching for the light, drop the light a little bit lower. Fluorescent bulbs and LED and like gentle LEDs, not like big grow LEDs, but either small plant lights or household LEDs. It's very unlikely that they'll burn the plant with too much light. Another thing to take in mind when you're starting your seeds is to keep a very gentle air circulation over them. So just you want a little bit of wiggle. The plants should be dancing a little bit, just a very gentle fan oscillating, not pointed at them, but indirectly in the room or in the grow tent. Point it up or point it down, point it somewhere where it's not going to sweep the plants, but it's going to move the air around enough for the plants to wiggle. That wiggle is really critical for young plants as well, because it strengthens their stalks. So just a little bit of stress sort of makes them a little tougher and less likely to flop over as the leaves get bigger and they become more top heavy. The final thing is inputs. The inputs for your seedlings. Everybody wants to start pushing nutrients right away, and that's not recommended at all for seedlings. Seedlings require little to no nutrition at all. They're going to be able to get through their first stage, the seedling stage of growth, without any added nutrients, as long as you're using a decent medium, like a seedling mix or a light mix potting soil. That should be all the nutrition the plant needs and more. The inputs that I do recommend for seedlings are not nutrients. They're other inputs that stimulate growth. There's a bunch of different schools of thought and strategies around this, but a few things that work for me as an organic grower as growth stimulants are aloe as an input. You can buy aloe vera powder as a supplement. I think it's advertised as agricultural input with some sellers. That contains salicylic and I think gibberellic acid, which stimulates root growth hormonally. So that's a natural way to stimulate growth and get faster growth for your seedlings. Coconut water is also a great choice, diluted. It has cytokinins and other enzymes that are plant available. When you think about a coconut is a seed. So contained in the coconut are several enzymes that are plant available that would theoretically go to help that coconut turn into a giant palm tree. You're going to harness a very diluted fraction of those enzymes and compounds to make available to your cannabis seedling. Another good additive at this point would be mycorrhizal fungi. These are microbial products that are good at various points throughout your grow, but have their highest leverage use at this early stage. when you're in the seedling stage, because the way these microbes function is they infect the roots of the plant. That's actually a fungus that infects the roots of the plant, but creates a symbiotic relationship with the plant where the plant feeds the fungus exudates, which are carbohydrates, basically sugars. The plant uses photosynthesis to produce sugars, different kinds of sugars that are exuded through the roots of the plant. It feeds the mycorrhizal fungi. The mycorrhizal fungi is like yum yum. And then in return, it serves as a transport system for nutrients in the soil, making nutrients in the soil that would not have been immediately available to the plant. It makes those nutrients available to the plant over longer distances. It also stores carbon in the soil. So we'll talk more about mycorrhizae, but it's this big change that happened in cannabis cultivation over the past like 5 to 10 years. And I know in conventional agriculture and horticulture as well. And it's been a huge game changer. At this point, everyone is using it. A few products I will send a product recommendation list again after the class today, but Dino Myco is a good one that people use a lot. And there's different mycorrhizal fungi products of different levels of credibility and reputability. But if you go to a store like Capital City Organics, those guys won't scam you. Everything they have there on the shelf is pretty reliable. Even if the pricing is a little higher, you'll know it's something good. So definitely recommend looking into mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi is something that you would apply at transplant because it infects the roots. What you need is exposed roots, and it's a powder or a dust that you kind of blot the exposed roots in, and then you transplant it. So if you have your seed started in the peat plug, when you pull the peat plug out of its little cell in the tray, you'll see a bunch of white roots. That's what you would roll around in the granulated mycorrhizal fungi, and then you place that into your solo cup, your small container, and that will ensure infection. And that association, that relationship between the plant and the fungi is now there. And for the rest of your grow, that mycorrhizal fungi will grow with the root system of your plants. Unless anything like really stressful or tragic happens, that infection should stay in place. And we say infection makes it sound bad, but that's a good infection. Your seedling stage, we're going to define the seedling stage as when you go from your germination. So whether that you germinated directly into the small container or you transplanted your peat plug into the small container. Oh yeah. A lot of potting soil has mycorrhizal fungi. Thanks for sharing that. Just to finish that thought, there are independent researchers have done a lot of studies to test like if a lot of these products that advertise they have mycorrhizal fungi actually have viable mycorrhizal fungi, and the results were mixed. So a lot of people are putting them into different products like potting soils, but sometimes those companies don't do their due diligence to ensure that the mycorrhizal fungi propagules or granules they put in there are actually ready to infect plant roots. They might not be living, so to speak. It's kind of like the difference between you go to the store and you buy, yogurt that is probiotic. So it's like biologically active, it's alive, that has a huge amount of benefits to your digestive system, or you go and you buy yogurt that's not probiotic, it's not alive, and it doesn't have the same benefits. So potting soil from Walmart, I'm not saying it doesn't have mycorrhizal fungi, it may or may not. But if that's something, if you have like the budget to invest in it, I would say buying a mycorrhizal fungi product that has mycorrhizal fungi that a species of mycorrhizal fungi that is known to associate with cannabis, that would make a big difference, because cannabis does associate with one specific species. So it's worth it to buy a cannabis specific product in this case, not in all cases. So we have our happy fungally inoculated seedling in our red solo cup. And we're going to grow that out a little bit, let it bush out. It's going to, because of the root structure, the plant is going to be like a little, kind of like a little mini tree. It's not going to branch out a lot at that point because the plant physiologically will grow to fit the root space that it has. So the plant knows that the root space is narrow, like in a small plastic pot. It's not going to grow out like this because it knows that it'll fall over. So the plant will itself train itself to keep it very compact. As long as you're keeping your light, at the proper distance from the top of the plant, it shouldn't get too leggy. It should stay pretty compact and stocky. You want to see a thick stem. The thicker the stem, the better. You want to see rapid growth. You want to be able to fill that small pot within 2 or 3 weeks. And the vegetative state, you go from, there's no clear line between, oh, it's a seedling, now it's vegetative. It's going to go from seedling to vegetative pretty much in that first small container. I'm going to define our vegetative cycle as when you fill that container and transplant to the second container. Thank you for that. Yeah, love the chat. So the way you know that your small container is full of roots and ready to be transplanted is just by, there's a few different ways to check this. One is usually by the time you get 4 or 5 nodes, which are like leaf pairs, usually it's like, that means it's ready to be transplanted. Another way you can sense when that pot is full or not is by keeping an eye on your watering. So you're gonna, when you water the plant, and you water it all the way through until water comes out of the bottom, see how long it takes to dry out. When your plant is small and your root system is small, that pot won't dry out for a few days. It'll still be moist. You'll want to, of course, always be diligent and check and don't let it dehydrate. But unless that soil is dry, it's not time to water. When the root system starts filling up that pot, you're going to notice that watering is going to become more regular. So when you first germinate your seed, or you first put that peat plug in there, you're going to be watering, maybe once every 3 days, once every 2 days. But then as the plant gets bigger and starts needing more water and filling out the soil in that cup, it's going to need more water. So you're going to find yourself watering every day. Then, if it gets a little out of control, you might end up watering twice a day. So at that point, you can kind of do a little check. It's very easy in a plastic pot. You just grab your small container and you feel it a little bit. You should feel, it's a little cakey or is it crumbly? And then you can very gently peek. So after, you don't do this right after watering, do it when the plant is dry. You'll loosen it up a little bit. And then there's 2 ways to do this, the way I do it and then the way I recommend it. The way I recommend it is to flip it over completely and very gently shimmy off the cup and just take a look. And if you're seeing roots caked around the soil, it's time to transplant. If you pull it off and some of it kind of crumbles and it's looking kind of like, you're not seeing a ton of roots, then it might need a little bit longer in that pot. The way I do it is I just like wiggle it and I just pull it up by the stem, because usually I know by that point I already know it's full or not, just based on how it looks above ground. So that's a little more dangerous, but that's one way to do it. Throughout your vegetative cycle, you're going to want your lights to be on either 24 hours or on for 18 hours, off for 6 hours, or anything in between. You don't want the plant to get less than 18 hours of light per day, because then you're missing out on photosynthetic potential. So the plant doesn't, people talk about plant food like nutrients. The plant doesn't eat nutrients. Nutrients are like vitamins and minerals. They're things that optimize, they're necessary for like certain key processes, but they're not actually feeding the plant. What the plant is actually eating is like photosynthesis. Like that's what it does. It eats the sun, and then other things eat it. And in doing so, they're taking in energy from the sun. That's sort of the physics of it. So the plant's eating the light, and it's putting on biomass, not from the mass that's in the soil. It's pulling carbon out of CO2 in the air, and it's using that carbon to grow leaves and bulk stems and grow roots. So, so when we talk about like plant eating and growing, we're talking about the plant photosynthesizing, using energy from the sun, and converting atmospheric carbon in the form of carbon dioxide into biological carbon, terrestrial carbon, compounds that include carbon that make up the cell's body, like cell walls and root hairs and all the things that, all the molecules, that very complicated molecules that make up a plant. So the more light the plant gets, the more it's going to eat, the more it's going to photosynthesize, the more carbon it's going to have energy to pull off of CO2 from the atmosphere and grow. A few different schools of thought. Some people have their plants on 24 hours a day, and they're perfectly fine. They do great. In fact, they say that it grows faster because it's getting more light. Other people like me, I prefer to just emulate nature a little bit more and give the plant some time to sleep and reset. A lot of growers, especially like organic and older school growers, will give the plant 6 hours to sleep at night to simulate nature and report some benefits as far as the plant's ability to withstand stress. Just like us, just a little bit of sleep every night, can help the plant reset a little bit. So I recommend having your lights on for 18 hours and off for 6 hours. I don't recommend trying to do this yourself. I recommend buying a very, simple and easy tool called the timer, and just putting the light on a timer, and you don't have to worry about it. During the vegetative stage, you don't need to worry about serious interruptions. So with it, the lights on for 18 hours, and then, you have to go in there for some reason and change something, you got to turn on the light to look around, no problem. It's not going to mess up the plant, excuse my language. You'll be totally fine. In the flowering stage, the dark needs to be dark, as we discussed last week. So vegetative stage, 18 hours on, 6 hours off. If that 6 hours is interrupted a little bit, it's not a big deal. Flowering stage, we're going to be 12 hours on, 12 hours off. You're going to have serious problems if you interrupt the 12 hours of darkness. Container for veg. From the solo cup, I'm going to just double check my chat here. Okay, gotcha. Great. I'm glad that answered your question. We're going to go back to veg here. So when you feel that your solo cup or small plastic container is full, the roots have filled the medium, you're going to want to transplant to the next size container. There's a few, we're going to talk a little bit more about transplanting, how to do it, why to do it, sort of the mechanics behind it. But I recommend transplanting regularly. So some people, there's a school of thought where, you just plant in the final container and You just let the plant just grow and fill out that space from when it's a tiny little seed till it's a giant, humongous flowering plant. It's in the same pot. I think that works for some people and some systems, particularly systems that are very biodiverse and have other plants involved. If it's just like a big bed of just like empty soil, like potting soil, the problem with starting your seed in the final container is it can be very challenging to water, because you're going to water the seed and then it's going to grow a little bit, and then you're going to have all this like dry, dusty soil around it. But if you water all that soil, there's no plant to eat that water, because it's like all the way out here. So then it just kind of sits there and it can get like moldy and funky and weird. If you have a cover crop, the cover crop can kind of work that moisture out a little bit, but cover cropping gets into a whole different methodology, which is actually really cool, but I'm not going to talk about it today because I don't recommend it for beginners. So for that reason, I recommend transplanting from a solo cup up to a half-gallon pot, from a half-gallon pot up to a 3-gallon pot, or from a half-gallon pot to a 5 or 7-gallon pot to finish in flower. So going on those steps really helps the root system grow in container gardening, especially a plant like cannabis, where the root system is so vigorous, but also the top is can get so big and heavy that you want to make sure you have foundational layers of root mass. The cool thing about transplanting is you fill up a solo cup, you put it in a half-gallon pot. Well, now you have like this like cake of roots that's like a strong anchor here, and then the roots are going to grow out to fill the half-gallon pot, and then you have like another cake or like layer or foundation of roots. And then when you go to a bigger pot, you have like another cake or layer of foundation of roots. So it's like every time you transplant, you have like another like shell or like net of roots. And that provides a lot of structural integrity for the plant, because as we'll talk about in flower, your plant's going to get very heavy. So you want the plant to have a good structure. It's not just about a happy, healthy plant, or, oh my God, it's getting so big. It's like, that's exciting, but you'll see as you get closer to that stage how important structure is. So transplanting regularly really provides good root structure that will pay off in the long run. So in the vegetative stage, we'll go from our solo cup to our half-gallon, and then our half-gallon to our 3, 5, or 7-gallon final container, depending on how large you'd like each plant to be. This half-gallon pot that I'm talking about will be a plastic container, because we're going to transplant again. So, if you're going to transplant, you don't want it in a fabric pot. It's very hard to take them out. Sometimes you just have to end up cutting them out. And when you rip the fabric, you can also rip the roots, because the roots grow into the fabric. That's kind of the cool part about fabric pots. So I recommend growing in a plastic nursery pot for our half-gallon step, or you could even do a gallon. As far as medium, when we transplant into our vegetative stage, we're going to be not growing in seedling or light medium anymore. We're going to grow in our potting soil. So we're going to grow in our Roots Organic Original, our Fox Farm Ocean Forest. We're going to use our full strength soil in this transplant, because the plant will now be big enough and strong enough to be able to make use of those nutrients. In the vegetative stage, you're still going to want some humidity, but not as much as you had in the seedling stage. So in the vegetative stage, I like to keep my humidity around 60%, no lower than 50. The humidity, the plants respond really well to humidity, as well as heat at this stage. Obviously you don't want to go any higher than 85, but 75 to 85 is a great temperature range to be in the vegetative stage, because that makes the plant's metabolism faster. And in the vegetative stage, you really just want to get strong, healthy, green leaf stem growth. You want to be building strong stems that will provide a good structure for the buds to grow on and flower. And you're going to want like healthy green leaves that will be photosynthesizing and working really hard to build up the plant's biomass. Inputs for vegetative stage. At this point, you can still keep your inputs and added like growth stimulants that I described in the seedling stage. But in the vegetative stage, you're going to want to introduce some supplemental nitrogen. Again, if you use the potting soils I recommended, you actually won't need to add additional liquid nutrients. But if you do want to stimulate faster growth, you can add, I would say, like a mild organic high nitrogen solution, still balanced. There's no products, you're not going to want to use a product that's just like straight nitrogen, but a balanced formulated liquid nutrient that supplements nitrogen would be good at this stage. At this point, you might also want to consider feeding your CalMag, calcium and magnesium, at a light strength, and also feeding silica as a aid to making stems stronger and making the plants more resistant to pests and disease. As I always recommend with all nutrient programs, no matter how excited you are or how organic or gentle the nutrient looks, feed half to start. And then, as you transplant up and you get a better sense of what the plant wants to eat and what it needs, then you can step up to the full strength. But always I recommend half strength feeding. Going to look through some questions now. So do I use soft-sided containers for each stage of uppotting? No, I use plastic, like regular black plastic nursery pots, like just plastic. I mean, cheap. I mean, I've actually reached the point where I don't even buy the I reuse a lot, but I actually just use these bags, like they're just grow bags. It's literally like plastic bags with holes in the bottom that I grow in. It's the container is not really the important part. I use plastic because you can slide the plant out when you're transplanting. If you use the soft side, I think you're referring to fabric pots. I don't use fabric pots in the seedling or vegetative stage because I want to be able to transplant to a fabric pot and finish the plant in a fabric pot. And then, that would be the final container. Grow the plant until it is 1.5x height of the container that you were growing in now, then transplant. No, there's no fixed height where you transplant at, because also that depends a lot on strain, so it's not like, oh, when it reaches this size proportional to the container transplant. The way you know when it's time to transplant is mostly by watering. When your plant seems to need water every day, or every other day, or twice a day. Certainly if the plant needs water twice a day, you're too late. If the plant dries out, like if the plant uses all of the water that you fed it every day, then that's usually means it's time to transplant. So that's the best way to know when it's time to transplant. We're going to talk more about watering, but these plants, they like to get watered all the way through, like until water comes out of the bottom. And then they like to dry out completely. That's their nature. That's what they like. They like to get really wet and then really dry, really wet and really dry. It's not always true. I'm making generalizations, but in an indoor system like this, that's usually the best way to make sure that you're watering properly. You measure humidity by using a hydrometer. the best thing to do is get a digital thermometer hydrometer. There are some that are indoor outdoor, which are really cool because it's like you have like a little panel that has a digital reading. I mean, these are like $20 or $15. They're really cheap. Looks like a digital clock. It says what temperature and humidity it is, where the panel is. And then there are some that have a little probe and it's inside outside. So they're designed that you take that probe and you put it outside your window so that it tells you what the inside is versus the outside. But if you buy this in a cannabis application, you can measure temperature and humidity at different points in the tent because there will become little microclimates as the plants get bigger. So it's good to know what's going on in different parts of the plant. So what I usually do is I take that thermometer and I put it at the soil level, like where or like somewhere like in more of an ambient area, like lower down, like even like down on the ground of the floor of the tent, and see what my temperature and humidity is there. And then I'll take the probe, it's usually attached by a little wire, and I'll suspend it at the canopy level. So where the top leaves are, that's called the canopy level. And so then I'll be able, that thermometer hydrometer will tell me the temperature and relative humidity, sort of like ambient in the tent down below, which is like the root zone. So you need to know that. And then also the temperature and humidity at where the leaves are, the canopy level. And it's important to know that. And they both need to be in that range. They both need to be in the proper range. If one is good and the other one's wrong, you might have to revisit, is your fan circulating the air properly? Is your light too hot? Is your floor cold? Like if you're in a basement, for example, the floor of the basement can get very cold. And so even though your leaves are good and your tent environment where your lights are shining are good, your roots are kind of cold and it's going to slow down the development of your plant. So that might mean, okay, I need to get my plants, I need to put my plants on a couple bricks to just get them off the ground. So those are some strategies for using a thermometer and hydrometer. Fish emulsion is great for vegetative stage. I highly recommend it. I love Neptune's Harvest. And there's a bunch of fish emulsion products out there that I use all the time. Like Alaska fish fertilizer is great for in veg. The only consideration for both of those products is that when you're using them inside, they smell really bad. So that's, the Buddha Grow, which is the vegetative nutrient product fertilizer I recommended in last week's email. That's nice because it's made out of soy. It's a soy-based product, which, might not be super aligned with everyone's values, but the fish emulsion is also kind of like farmed fish. Like these products were not like handcrafted, by like some hipster, like with a beard or something, like in like Vermont. Like these products, a lot of these fertilizers and agricultural products are like industrial waste, redirected waste. So anyway, the fertilizers I recommend are mostly just like soy hydrolysate, basically like fermented soy that, brings that is digested sort of in a way that makes the nitrogen in the soy available to a plant. And that stuff's good because it doesn't smell. Fish emulsion is awesome, super natural, super like dope for outside. Inside, it just makes your house smell fishy. We have okay, and so now I'm going to talk about training, and I'm going to finally answer Toby's question about pinching the meristems. That's a very technical way to describe topping. When you're in your vegetative stage, this is your opportunity to train your plant. Once you're flowering, it's impossible to train the plant because the plant isn't growing stems and leaves in a way that's responsive to your manipulation. So when you're in the vegetative stage, that's when you're going to want to do your topping and training. I have a whole slide on topping and training, but I just wanted to note that the vegetative stage is the time that we're going to be doing that. Finally, flowering. In flowering, you're going to use a 12-12 light cycle. So you're going to reset your timer to be 12 hours on, 12 hours off. During that 12 hours off, you're going to want to make sure that there's no light leaking in. The dark needs to be dark. Again, why I recommend a tent, because it's like a light tight zipper seal that even if the light's on and ambiently in the room, that tent will stay dark. So think about, before you decide like what you're going to set your timer to, think about your lifestyle, think about your schedule, think about your space. If you're growing in a space that can get chilly and you're headed toward fall or winter, I recommend running your lights on at night, because it'll keep the tent warm when the ambient temperature drops. Another consideration is your own time. So when in the flowering stage, the only time that you should be interacting with the plants is when the lights are on, because if you interact with the plants with the lights off, you risk creating a light leak, which causes hormonal issues with the plant, which very often causes the plant to create male flowers, which are pollen sacs. Those pollen sacs will allow the plant to self-pollinate, meaning that you'll have seeds in your weed, which is not desirable for most people, because seed creation takes a lot of energy out of the plant. So it usually decreases the potency. The energy the plant would be spending on building trichomes and cannabinoids and medicine instead goes into making seeds. And so your product will be less potent. And also those seeds will be more susceptible to showing intersex traits, because they came from intersex pollen. So they came from a female plant, like pollinating itself because of stress, light stress. So those seeds can be very problematic. Thank you for the reminder about sunset. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to take a break after this slide, and we're going to run out there and look at an outdoor grow environment. After you fill out your half-gallon pot in the vegetative stage, and again, you're going to tell that by when watering becomes more frequent, when the plant starts to look kind of big for the container, you're going to do that little check, a little squeeze check. Does it feel like a little cake in here? Okay, it feels cakey. I'm going to either pull it up a little bit or flip it upside down and slide the pot up a little bit. Okay, am I seeing white roots kind of starting to move around the outside? Okay, it's time to transplant. Then we're going to go into our final container. I would recommend for an indoor grow a 3, 5, or 7 gallon fabric pot as your final container. For an outdoor grow, I would recommend a minimum 10 to 15 gallon fabric container, because you're going to see a lot more rapid growth. You're going to do your transplant into this final pot. You're not going to want to let this plant fully fill out the pot, because the roots are going to keep growing during the flowering stage. So you're going to move it into this pot, let it get comfortable, let it get over its transplant shock, let it get acquainted with the new environment, the new pot it's in. And then you will flip to flower. We call this the flip. When to flip to flower, you want to make sure that your plant has started to fill the final container that it's in. So not root bound, not like fully full watering every day, but also not just like sitting there all small and hasn't gone into the rest of the pot. Usually to get to the stage after your last transplant, I would say it's like 2 to 4 weeks. On the, if you go from half gallon to 3 gallon, maybe it's 2 or 3 weeks. If you go from half gallon to 5 gallon or 7 gallon, it might be closer to that 3 to 4 to 5 range. but you want to start seeing bushing growth in that last container before you flip. When you flip from 18 hours on, 6 hours off to 12 hours on, 12 hours off, the flip, there's going to be what's called the flowering stretch. When the plant realizes that the light cycle has changed, before it initiates flowering, it's going to spend 2 weeks growing like it's never grown before. The roots are going to aggressively fill in the container. And then you're going to see, I mean, it can be actually kind of terrifying how fast the plant grows when it's doing that flowering stretch. You will see like overnight growth during that period, because the plant is basically saying, okay, the light cycle is changed. Fall is here. I have to reproduce. I have to flower. So I have to get as big as possible. I have to get taller than all the other plants so that I can get the most pollen and reproduce. That's what the plant's thinking. So it's going to grow really aggressively. You can manage that stretch, because sometimes that stretch can be problematic because it just wants to do this. It just wants to go vertical. So it'll want to like smash into your light. It'll like literally grow into the light and then over the light if you let it, which is really not good for the plant. The way to manage that is to top and train, as I'm going to discuss in a future slide, but just pinching off the tips of the plants. We're going to talk more about that. Or weaving the plant into a trellis. So if people have seen a trellis that you use for tomatoes or avocados, just it's like a plastic grid basically. And what people do is they suspend it horizontally across at the desired canopy level of the plant, and sort of weave the plant down and kind of push the plant under and train it. In flowering, your inputs will be nutrients that have a emphasis on phosphorus and potassium, P and K. So in veg, we're going to be feeding a lot more N, and in flowering, we're going to feed more PK, which is phosphorus and potassium. Again, there are products created for cannabis plants flowering that boost the flower production, the potency, the smell. These products are formulated and engineered for growing cannabis. I recommend just looking at the, reputable brands, what they offer as far as flower or bloom products. A lot of those products also contain molasses, which is just unrefined sugar. Molasses is actually microbe food. So it doesn't feed the plant. The molasses feeds the microbes. The microbes start working overtime and allow the plant to eat more. And then in flowering, your environment also is going to change a little bit. You can in flowering, the plant thinks it's in fall, so the temperature can come down a little bit if you like, and the humidity can also come down. The humidity should come down to 45 to 55, no higher than 60. Dropping humidity reduces the risk of the flowers getting moldy or rotting. If those flowers get too humid or too wet, they will mold, rot, or accumulate powdery mildew. There's a lot of things that can happen to those flowers. So keeping the environment dry is usually better. And temperature, you don't, again, walking the, if you're at, under 85, you're still fine. But the cool thing about dropping temperature during flowering is the plants do become more resinous and more potent. And also they do this really cool thing where they turn purple, or a lot of the modern genetics will turn purple as a response to cold. So dropping temperature in flower and seeing what colors the plant wants to express, we call them fall colors. That's definitely something that makes growing way more fun. I'm going to take an intermission right now and show folks my backyard so you can see a little bit of what a outdoor grow environment looks like. I'm going to stop my share here, stop my video, and move over to my phone. Can folks see me? Yep. Okay, cool. And I'm hoping people can hear me too, unlike last time. Great. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate you. So, just taking this opportunity to show you what a good outdoor grow environment might look like. I'm going to show you a couple different options depending on what your flavor is. This is a 10-gallon fabric pot. So this is a great place to grow like a small plant for personal use. I actually blended the soil myself, but imagine this is full of Roots Organic, Original, or Fox Farm soil, the kind that I've recommended to you guys. As you can see, it's a little fenced-in garden that prevents deer from eating the cannabis. It's a thing. It's horrible. It's depressing. It's like, and they will always just eat like the nicest, greenest little sort of shoots. So they can actually really devastate your plants. So definitely recommend some fencing. I'll show you guys some other options here. This is a 65-gallon bed. You can grow a humongous plant in a bed like this. To make full use of a 65-gallon fabric bed, you would want to have a pretty substantially sized plant get transplanted out here in May, like that's already kind of fully grown. So like, a half-gallon or better, a 3-gallon plant in veg, transplant that out in May and just let it grow and fill out this pot all season. You would get a pretty humongous plant here. This is a 125-gallon bed. Oh, did you say something, Josh? I don't know. Anyway, this 125-gallon bed, I actually have grown 2 plants in this before. So, sort of 60. I think any bigger than 60 is diminishing returns. So, just with our growing season in a place that has a longer growing season, people are growing in 200 to 400-gallon containers, like in Oregon and California. But here on the East Coast, I would say 30 is big. 60 is ridiculous because I'm a ridiculous person, and then 10 is like, is a really good is the minimum, I would say. Getting a little tour of my somewhat messy urban farm. As you can see, this is a very private area. The only reason I grow this much outside is because I have an extremely private backyard. This is where I grow my plants in the native soil. This is actually, fluctuates between a vegetable garden and a cannabis garden, depending on the time of year. Right now, I'm growing like kale and radishes.
and then I'll harvest those in mid-May and transplant my cannabis out here and grow that for the summer, and then plant another fall vegetables and fall cover crops, and overwinter those. So this a bed like this can grow about 6 big giant plants. So 6 plants here, 6 plants here. I stretch greenhouse plastic over this greenhouse, and just the 12 plants here fills out this entire canopy, about 200 square feet. And without going over your limits or not going over them too far, it's quite a bit of medicine. So if you're growing in native soil and not a container, I definitely recommend testing your soil with UDC, which serves as our agricultural extension. They are pretty responsive, pretty affordable, and will give you just ask them for recommendations on growing tomatoes, and they'll be able to give you advice on how to amend your soil properly to create a good base soil for growing cannabis. Mostly what I've done is I've tilled in high quality compost here. Well, maybe not that high quality. I've just tilled in compost here, added some raw amendments like I discussed last week, and test it to make sure that all of my essential plant nutrients are available here. I also grow some herbs, and this is goldenrod, just want to have some biodiversity here. If you're growing more than a few plants, you're going to want some other plants around to attract beneficial predator insects, and just generally keep your ecosystem healthy and happy. This is a watering system I've installed here. It's on a timer. This timer basically automatically turns on the hose at a set intervals, and these beds are watered with this soaker hose, which is this is a very inexpensive setup. This is just a garden hose timer, a splitter, and then soaker hoses, and they just sort of let water trickle out evenly across the bed, keeping the soil moist and cool on hot days. And I turn off the irrigation system when it's rainy. And then the other essential component, whether you're growing in soil beds or in containers, is mulch. So straw mulch is really ideal. Just a nice thick layer of straw mulch helps you retain moisture, and reduces need for watering. And it also keeps your plants from getting cooked on hot days, especially in containers and black containers like that. Hot days in DC can be tough on plants, so mulch really helps. So yeah, that is my garden. Another thing people do sometimes when they're growing in containers outside, they'll put the container on a pallet. Us urban farmers, we love pallets. I don't know if you're hip, Josh, to the plastic pallet. It's this amazing new thing they invented, and they're a little bit harder to steal than the wooden pallets, but if you ever get a chance to steal them, they are awesome. They don't rot or break or fall apart. You don't get splinters. They're heavier. They last forever. So plastic pallets for the win. And yeah, if you're growing outside, just be really, really conscious of your neighbors. Whoever, make sure you find out who has access to that space. Make sure no kids or animals have access to that space. My area is really carefully fenced off and hidden from public view as well as from my neighbor's view. A few of them, let's say, might suspect, but I have great relationships in my neighborhood and I've never had a problem over here. But, you know, definitely it's something that you would proceed at your own risk.
So it's not stealing, it's repurposing. Exactly. I'm just recycling. So that is the end of the outside garden tour. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to go back to my screen share here. Water. So water in DC, tap water is pretty good. Doesn't require a lot of filtration. Obviously, if you're on a different city, you know, just test your water. Water quality test results are actually available. They're kind of in the public domain. So every water utility, water provider will share, you know, what the dissolved solids, heavy metals, that kind of thing. So unless there's anything like there's like a huge amount of lead or, you know, arsenic or mercury, unless there's like major contamination issues, you're, you know, in this area, our water's pretty good. The issue is pH. As I mentioned last week, plants prefer their water to be within a pH range of 6 to 7. Over 7, you do start to see a reduction in nutrient uptake. So the plant's ability to take up certain nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, silica is inhibited as the pH goes higher than 7 or lower than 6. In DC, our tap water is 8. Not a huge deal, but it needs a little bit of correction. So you can, the way to make sure that your water is ideal for cannabis plants is to put your water that you're going to use into a bucket or a vessel or a watering can. Even 2-gallon watering can is great. And add pH down, which is a product that's very affordable and easy to find. It's a diluted phosphoric acid. It sounds scary. It's not. It's really, really common in horticulture to adjust pH. And you can verify what your final pH is by using an inexpensive pH meter. You can get those on Amazon. Again, I wouldn't get the cheapest one, but you don't need the $300 one like I have. You can, you know, pretty reliably use that. Eventually, you're going to kind of figure out, you know, how much pH down you're going to use. I mean, our pH doesn't fluctuate really that much here in DC. So, you know, you can start to sort of eyeball it and feel it out. And another thing to keep in mind is that when you are using nutrients in your water, like liquid nutrients, they will usually drop the pH. So make sure that you test the pH after you've added your nutrients, so you don't drop your pH to 6 and then your nutrients sink it even further down. The main nutrient to watch out for with pH, it can be very useful, is silica. So when you're using silica, the product I recommended is Protect by Dynagrow. Silica will very dramatically raise your pH. Most nutrients drop your pH, silica will raise your pH. So if you're using silica, usually what you do is you add silica first into just the clear water. And then after it's like stirred up and integrated in the water, then you will test and adjust your pH. So adding more chlorine, just putting the water in a bucket for a week or two, allow the chlorine to vaporize. So if it's chlorine in the water, yes, you can just put the water in a bucket, let it sit overnight, and most of that chlorine will evaporate it off. If it's chloramine, chloramine is a more stable molecule, which they sometimes use, I believe, in the summer months instead of chlorine, because the chlorine evaporates off, so it's not as effective in the summer. So DC switches between chlorine and chloramine. DC puts chlorine in the water in the winter and chloramine in the water in the summer. Chlorine will evaporate off. Chloramine will not. Chloramine is stable. You can remove chloramine from water by adding vitamin C. So you can just get like a vitamin C supplement, like crushed up, like crush up a vitamin C pill and put it in there. Also helps with pH. Another thing that gets rid of chloramine is humic acid. Humic acid is the brown like juice that makes soil dope. It's there's a lot of science to what humic acid is, but it's the easiest thing in the world to find because it's in compost and most soils throughout the world. So to get rid of chloramine, a very easy way to get rid of chloramine is to either put vitamin C in the water or take a handful of compost and throw it in the bucket and just let it chill overnight. So instead of just letting it sit overnight, like with chlorine in the summer, take a handful of compost, throw it in the bucket, and your plants will love it. You don't have to use that much. You can also buy humic acid, depending on what your watering system is like. For example, if you're running through a drip line, or if you have a pump and you're watering with a sprayer, you can't necessarily just throw dirt into your bucket. So you can buy humic acid online very easily, or at the hydro store. It comes in a little bottle. It should say it's OMRI listed, approved for use in organic agriculture. Humic acid has a lot of benefits to plants. The number one in my mind is that it dechlorinates your water, and dechlorinates your water as well. So, and that's instant. You just put it in, mix it up. The chloramine is gone. The chlorine is gone. So humic acid is great. Yes, compost tea is an excellent source of humic acid, and we're going to talk more about compost teas shortly. But any compost product will have a naturally occurring source of humic acid. So that's great. This all being said, your filter, if you have a decent water filter, it will remove chlorine and both chlorine and chloramine. The pH being 8, but usually by the time you add your nutrients, the pH comes down to like a reasonable range. And even if you just water with DC tap water that has chlorine or chloramine and pH of 8, it's fine. Like if people make a huge deal about this stuff, I think unless you're, it's kind of like there's a big theme here you're probably getting is like there's the optimal perfect thing to do, and then there's like the thing that'll work. And you can just water your plants with tap water. It's okay. For the love of God, first of all, do not use reverse osmosis water. It's super wasteful, super expensive. It actually strips the nutrients out of your soil. So RO water is terrible. People do that because they like think they're doing it the best, and it actually is so much worse. And then don't go to the Safeway and buy 5-gallon jugs of spring water. That's like so wasteful and so expensive. So I would say, tap water is fine. If you have the opportunity to mix in humic acid and adjust the pH, great. If you don't, it's not a huge deal. You'll be fine in a system like this. In a synthetic system, these things matter a lot more when you're using synthetic nutrient salts and inert media like cocoa or peat or perlite or hydro rock wool. This stuff really matters in those systems. But nothing I've told you is about those systems. So if you're meeting other growers and they're insisting on pH and tap water is evil and you have to do all this stuff to your water and stuff, it's probably because they've learned from people who are growing with synthetic nutrients, and I'm not teaching that way. So it's not a huge deal in organic horticulture. If you don't, like I said, if you don't remove the chloramine, it won't affect the taste at all. The reason they put chloramine in water is because it kills microbes. So if you use chlorinated or chloraminated water to water your plants, it will kill some of the microbes in the top layer of your pot, of your container, because that's what those compounds are designed to do. That's why they add them to water. usually by the time they get further than that first inch, there's enough humic acids naturally occurring in the soil to remove the chlorine and chloramine, and the microbes in the rest of the container should be fine. It's just, again, just like that little optimization that sometimes can make a difference if you're like taking this really seriously, but it's not going to be a deal breaker. Aeration is something else you might want to look into. Aeration is the process of pumping air into the water that you can use to water your plants. By raising the dissolved oxygen level in the water, it stimulates plant growth. Any opportunity you get to boost the air to water ratio in your root zone is great. The more porous, the more air and oxygen it has in the root zone, the better. Aeration also accelerates the breakdown of chlorine, and it also accelerates the reproduction of microbes in a compost tea. So we're going to revisit aeration. I'm going to mostly recommend it for compost tea. Watering systems. If you just have a few plants in regular sized containers, a watering can should do it, or a bucket with like a quart size like yogurt container to like scoop the water into the plants. If you have more plants, you can set up a reservoir with a pump and attach a hose with like a watering wand. If you're outside, obviously you can use your hose. You can attach a filter, an inline filter to the hose, and just water straight out of the hose. Not a big deal. Or you can water into a bucket or reservoir, adjust the pH, add some humic acid, and water by hand out of that. So, I don't recommend, complicated irrigation systems. If you're, some people like to keep big reservoirs in their grow space. I don't recommend that if you have fewer than, if you don't have a full room of plants to water, it's probably not that important. It's not that hard to fill up a 5-gallon bucket and just water out of that. We've talked about overwatering and underwatering. Overwatering can cause a lot of problems with plants. It's not that it's overwatered, it's actually that it is suffocating because it doesn't have enough oxygen. So when I was saying that plants like to get watered deeply and then dry out, it's because in that dry out is when they have access to oxygen. The way to make sure you're not overwatering is you'll water your plant deeply until water comes out the bottom, and you'll let it dry out completely, and you don't water again until you put your finger in the up to your second knuckle here. And if you feel water, then don't water. Even if it feels like, if it looks dry on top, if you feel moisture down here, don't water it. If you put it in here and it's dry here, okay, now water it. So that's the finger test. So if the plant has any moisture at all, I mean, obviously you don't want it to get totally parched, but let it dry out. That's the number one rookie mistake, is overwatering. Cutting off the oxygen stresses the plants, slows down growth, causes the potential for fungal infections in the root zone. It makes the plant weak and susceptible to pests in the plant, the upper areas of the plant. The water frequency for outdoor in-ground plants. So if you're in the ground, the plant can actually has access to a lot of water in the water table, especially in DC. If you're like in ground, like it's moist down there. Like DC's nice and wet and spongy. If you're in the ground, you really shouldn't need to water as much as in a container, especially a fabric container that's getting cooked by the sun all day and dries out really fast. I can't tell you a water frequency because it's so intuitive. The best way is to do the finger check. If you've had if it's been like a really hot day, I would say like any day over 90 degrees, I would water. But just to keep the plant cool and to keep it sort of comfortable, Also why it's important to have like good thick mulch to keep the soil from like cooking. But yeah, same thing as inside the ground as in containers. Just do the finger check. If you're feeling moisture, the plant's probably okay. The good thing about outdoor is the plants can unless you really overdo it, the plants can tolerate more water. Like you're not going to kill it. Like you're not going to suffocate it the same way, because the water will be absorbed by other plants and the soil elsewhere. So usually outdoor in ground, after they get to a certain point, the roots get deep enough where they're not going to need the same level of regular watering. You're usually going to water for to feed, so it's kind of like water whenever you have time to, do it whenever you have time to like give the plants like some good liquid nutrients. But again, it's very can be very subjective. Nutrients, we discussed this, NPK, we're going to use a higher N formula for vegetative. We're going to use a higher PK formula for flowering. Micronutrients are the other 14 elements that the plant uses that are not N, P, or K, which, are not emphasized as much, but in a soil in an organic system, you shouldn't have too many deficiencies for micronutrients because the soil should be providing a lot of those. You can run into deficiencies at times of certain particular micronutrients. The main deficiency you'll run into in an organic soil system like the one I'm describing will be calcium and magnesium. There are things that will turn up as micronutrients, and there's like these micronutrient deficiency charts online, and people see those and like, oh my God, my plant looks exactly like that. But it's actually, the problem is like due to a pest or disease, or they've overwatered, so they've locked out some nutrients, or their pH is wrong, so the plant can't access that nutrient no matter how much you feed it. So deficiencies are like always the first plant diagnosis, but they're usually the wrong plant diagnosis. Like I said, these products I'm recommending to you, like these soils, you should pretty much be able to get from start to finish without any additional nutrients. So if you're seeing like random deficiencies, it's probably not because like, oh, I need to go find iron and add iron, or oh, I need to go find sulfur and add sulfur. It might be because your watering's wrong, or there's a pest, or the pH is wrong, or the temperature's wrong, or there's something stressful going on that the plant's responding to. And it looks like a deficiency, but it's not. So you're not going to run into a bunch of micronutrient deficiencies in the system like this. The ways you'd run into those other than calcium and magnesium would be if you're overfeeding NPK. They can antagonize other elements. So if you overdo nitrogen, it can lock out certain micronutrients. If you overdo phosphorus and potassium, it can lock out other micronutrients. So less is more. Growth stimulants and other additives, as I mentioned, mycorrhizal fungi at transplant is great. You can add mycorrhizal fungi every time you transplant in order to refresh and boost the population. Or in case, something happened, and, you lost your mycorrhizae from the first inoculation. As I mentioned, molasses is great. As I think it's about 1 or 2 teaspoons per gallon, not that much. Unsulfured blackstrap molasses is good because it feeds the microbes in the soil. So the happier your microbes, the happier your plants. Aloe and coconut water work throughout all stages of plant growth. While they're might be more helpful in seedling stage, they certainly are always welcome. Humic acid is another input that has a lot of benefits to a plant as well. It also allows your soil particles. It aids the structure of the soil. It creates what's called aggregates. So it keeps your soil from getting too powdery and like munched up. Like it'll help the soil glob together. And then amendments, as I mentioned, you can amend your soil before you transplant. And you can also put these amendments on the surface of your soil in order to feed it as like a dry fertilizer rather than using liquid nutrients. I do that plenty. My only recommendation is if you're going to top dress amendments, like if you're going to use these dry fertilizers on top of the plant, make sure you put them on, water them in like nice, and make sure you get all the pockets that there's no dry spots, and then put mulch on top, so that the amendments aren't just open to the environment, because the amendments are so nutrient rich that they are more liable to get eaten by small arthropods, fungus gnats, fungi, mites. You're going to get a lot of bugs if you have just like raw amendments like lying there wet on top of your soil. So put the amendments down at the recommended rate, water them in, and put the mulch on top to keep everything like underground. Like while we're talking about the soil microbiome, vermicompost is a great input for cannabis. Cannabis loves worm compost or vermicompost. Maybe Josh will have some recommendations for where to get great local worm poop, but you can also make your own. You can use a worm bin, you can use a worm tumbler, and you can also buy it at the grow stores as well as landscape and garden centers. There are a few worm compost products that are advertised as worm poop that are not very biologically active. Like I was describing, you have like the probiotic yogurt, and you have like the Go-Gurt or whatever. Like there's some stuff that's like, yeah, it's worm poop, but it's not fresh and it's not biologically active. So, just pay attention to price points, and not like worm poop is expensive, and you don't need that much. So, if it's like suspiciously cheap, like make sure that it's actually legit. You can top dress worm poop, like I was saying, like other amendments. And you can also brew compost or vermicompost into a compost tea. In order to do this process, for the home grower, I recommend a 5-gallon bucket, a cheap aquarium pump with an air stone. I'll send some links to these. They're available on Amazon for $20. You can also buy them at the grow store, and you'll fill up your bucket with water. You'll put, a pint to a quart of compost in the bucket. You can either put it in a cheesecloth bag. Some people like to do that to like make it neat and nice. I just throw it in loose and stir it up with a stick. And then you're going to add 2 tablespoons of unsulfured blackstrap molasses. This is optional, but it does help the compost tea develop faster. You're going to brew your compost and molasses in this bucket with the water bubbling through it for 24 hours, no longer than 36. And then you're going to dump that on your plants. The easiest way is to just take out the air stone, give it another good stir with the stick, and then reach in with a quart container, or you can fill up a watering can and water it in. You cannot save it. You have to use it fresh. You can't like let it sit around. It's going to get disgusting. So, and you're going to want the dissolved oxygen to be high when you feed it. So it's an actively aerated compost tea, and you're going to use it fresh. And a little goes a long way. It's strong stuff. The science of what you're doing is compost and vermicompost have tons of microorganisms that are beneficial to plants in them. What you can do is get the benefit of those microorganisms without using too much of the actual compost material by putting those microorganisms in an environment where they're going to reproduce and increase in population and be available, make it so that you can add them to the plant, and the plant can develop relationships with those microbes and create a more balanced microbial ecosystem. these these microbial ecosystems allow the plant to eat more efficiently. They allow the plant to be more resilient to pest and disease, because there's not like no bad bugs can take control because there's so many good bugs swimming around. And of course, the humic acid content in these compost teas also, improve the soil structure and stimulate soil aggregation, which means pieces of soil globbing together rather than turning dusty. If you don't have the time and energy to make compost teas, because it does take 24 hours of sort of advance notice, and need a place where you can like brew some worm poop, and it can be a little smelly, like it gets a little funky because the microbes eat the molasses and they start like having like a big party and reproducing. And, at the end, it's like this kind of grayish, brownish, bubbly stew. If that's not like really for you, or you don't have the space, you don't have the time, there are compost extracts you can buy. A good one, a few I recommend are Photosynthesis Plus. Is just a sort of a compost tea in a bottle you add to water, and it has similar effects to compost tea. Not all the benefits, because it's not actively aerated and it's not fresh, but it's pretty good. Another product people use is it's called, forgive my French, it's called Fish Shit. That is the name of the brand. It's really smelly, but it is really good. It has a ton of microbes that are derived from fish manure, concentrated down, and have been proven to stimulate plant growth and makes healthy soil ecosystems. Another one, which is very expensive, but is sort of industry standard and people really love it, is called Mammoth P. Mammoth P is a microbial input that is an engineered community of microbes specifically selected to boost the uptake of phosphorus in cannabis. So it allows your plant to use more phosphorus with feeding less fertilizer, and makes that phosphorus more plant available. So that's really expensive, but that stuff, you buy a bottle of that stuff, it lasts forever because it's a microbe. So you only have to use a little bit. And yeah. Transplant. Oh my God, we're running out of time again. So transplanting, we've talked quite a bit about transplanting. I think I already described why to transplant. It's because it creates these layers of these layers of root ball that offer more structural integrity to the plant. As I mentioned earlier, plan out your transplants. Do not go into a fabric pot if you're going to transplant to a bigger pot. Keep it in plastic until you get to the final pot, because plastic is like 18,000 times easier to transplant and less stressful to the plant. Fabric pots are like awesome for like finishing your plants and flowering, but not good for transplanting. In order to reduce shock from transplanting, when you remove the plant with its root ball from the old container, you're going to want to massage lightly the roots. You're not going to want it to be bone dry when you do this, but pretty dry. If it's wet, like it could, like the root ball kind of falls apart and more root gets exposed. So make sure it's dry enough to handle as like a firm thing. So you're going to massage it a little bit. You might want to give it a little bit of mycorrhizal fungi in the hole where you're putting the plant in the new pot, and then some vermicompost is usually really nice to put in that planting hole as well. You're going to put it in there, and you're going to take the soil around that recent transplant hole and really push it in. This is a very porous, airy, soilless medium. So you can push it down, it's still going to stay airy. You're not going to compact it. It's not like farming in a field somewhere. Like, this is fluffy stuff. So just really push it down in there, and then give it a really nice water, and turn the light down a little bit. If you have a dimmer, just turn the light down a little bit, maybe raise it up a little bit. Make sure your environment is really good and comfortable. Keep an eye on humidity. Humidity might spike after a transplant because the roots haven't gotten into the new soil yet. So make sure it doesn't get too stale in there, make sure there's a good oscillating fan. Um, over vegging. So something that happens with cannabis is you keep it in vegetative stage for too long, and it gets too big for its britches, so to speak. So if you don't flip to flower early enough, the plant starts to fill out the pot, and the top part of the plant starts to get too lanky and bushy. So by the time you flower, it's like it becomes root bound, like it fills out the pot. And once you're flowering, you can't transplant because it's too stressful. And then your plant above ground is too big and bushy. So when it does its flowering stretch, it like gets too big for your environment. So just be conscious to not to over veg, and flip to flower conservatively, because your plant will double in size when you do that flip. That flowering stretch will, in 2 weeks, the rule of thumb is your plant will double. Some strains like Gorilla Glue and ChemDog will triple in size. So I can't overstate how much the plants will grow. So if the plants are like halfway, if the tent is halfway full, flip to flower, that will fill the tent. Plant training, you can train plants to make them healthier, and you can train plants to increase the yield. The most popular way of training, which is what I preach, is called topping. That's where you pinch off the apical meristem. So what you're going to do is, sorry, I don't have a teaching tool right now, but you can look this up online pretty easily. Topping cannabis. You'll just pinch off the tippy top of the plant. Just pinch it off right there where that middle stem is. And you're gonna be like, what? I just pull it off? Yeah, just top it off. The plant will respond by branching outward. So if you don't top it, it's gonna grow like a Christmas tree, like this, with the little branches coming out like this. If you top it, what'll happen is it'll bush out like kind of like a sphere, kind of like a circle bush, which is good, because then the branches from the bottom will have a chance to actually get to the top and become flowers. And then the ones from the middle will come to the top and become flowers. And then, the shorter ones in the center will become flowers. So by breaking that dominant top, you're giving the other branches a chance to catch up, and you're creating a more symmetrical plant where you have more flowers that are equally distributed structurally. For that reason, I recommend not topping once. You top several times throughout the growth cycle, and just look at the plant, see what effect topping has. I'm going to pinch this one. That means these two will come out. Okay, well, now these two now I have two rather than one, but then my other stems are still not getting close enough to the light. Okay, so let me top these two tops here. And now maybe I have a chance for these other branches to get closer to the light. So you don't want a Christmas tree, you want a menorah, because the light is a flat source of light, and your flowers are going to grow based on how much light they get. So if you have like a canopy full of flowers that are all even, that's making most efficient use of the light. If you have a Christmas tree, this flower is going to be awesome, and then all these flowers are going to suck. Another way to achieve this shape is, instead of topping, or in addition to topping, you can do an LST, which is a tie down. And you can do a combination of these. Sometimes people will top, and then when they get this Y here, they'll tie the Y down to the sides of the pot. They'll punch holes in the side of the pot and tie it down with soft wire tie or twine, and bend them down to give the other ones a chance to come up. So you can do these gentle, low stress training manipulations in order to get the plant to the shape you want. Scrogging is another strategy. That is where you use a plastic or nylon trellis horizontally across the tent. And basically you're going to decide, this is where my canopy is going to be. And that anytime the plant grows past it, you just push it back down and fold it underneath in that trellis until you get like a full, it's almost like you treat it almost like a vine. until you get a full scrog. Your trellis is completely full, nothing's poking up. Every time it goes up, you weave it back down. And then you flip your lights and then you stop scrogging. And so what'll happen is you have your plants coming up. They're all folded into this trellis here. And until you fill up that trellis. And then you're going to flip to 12-12. And then they're going to do this stretch, but they're going to do it in a symmetrical way. They're just going to go woo. And that is your canopy of flowers. That's scrogging. Again, you can look that up. And defoliation is pulling the leaves off of the plants. You are going to want to defoliate in order to increase airflow. Defoliating itself, pulling off leaves, doesn't make the plant better necessarily, but it will improve the microclimate of the plant. So if you see an area of the plant where there's like a bunch of like little leaves, especially like big flappy leaves or like little kind of like yellowy shitty or not so great leaves like all bunched up together, that's creating a very humid microclimate, which makes the plant vulnerable to like pests and disease. So you would want to pull those leaves off in order to increase the airflow throughout the plant. So don't pull off leaves just for fun, but if there's a reason to pull off the leaves in order to increase airflow. My last slide today. Oh, yes, you can and you must top your outdoor plants. Even more so, I think it's even more important to top your outdoor plants because you're going to want to redistribute your plant's flowering energy throughout several different tops and branches, rather than just having one big giant Christmas tree bud at the top. Because that big giant Christmas tree bud is really vulnerable to humidity. If any one bud is too big, it could rot. It can fall, it can get too heavy and flop down if there's a storm or rain or something, especially. Whereas topping redistributes the plant's flowering energy to multiple different branches so that you have like, it's better to have like 10 like good solid size like big buds rather than like one giant one and 9 like kind of crummy ones. The last slide here is integrated pest management, or IPM. The purpose of IPM is to prevent your plant from being overtaken or harmed by any one pest. Pests include mites, fungi, animals, and arguably humans. The first one, humans, we already talked about that in the context of security. You know, humans can be a pest because they can destroy or steal your plants. Working our way back down, if you are outside, animals are a consideration. Deer, like I said, will munch on your leaves and kill your plants. I've heard that mice and rats can chew on stems and destroy plants. I haven't seen it in my garden, but you know, that's why I try to fence off my growing areas and just keep an eye out for any wildlife I see. The biggest ones you're going to run into, though, are mites and insects and fungi. And this is a very, very difficult part of growing, and it's the least fun part. And it's also the most important part once you get the fundamentals down, because it's not a matter of if you will get pests, it's a matter of when you will get pests and which pests they will be. So we're going to focus on prevention first. The way you prevent pests is by growing healthy plants in the proper environmental conditions. If your environment is optimal for the plant's growth, the plant is healthy, and you're not overfeeding it, you're not stressing it out, it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's not too dry, it's not too wet, that's a very strong preventative approach. You shouldn't have too many pest problems as long as your environment is happy and healthy. Identifying pests. If and when you do get a pest, you need to figure out which pest it is, because that will inform how you treat it. The very common pest is the two-spotted spider mite. I know that exists in other crops, but I don't know how prevalent it is. In cannabis, it's probably the most popular, the most common mite here in our region. And it can be really devastating to a grow if you don't treat it properly. So the way you would identify a two-spotted spider mite is little white, little tiny white holes in the leaves, or like chewed out parts, called stippling. So if it looks like a little sandy almost, that means those are the mites like biting the leaves. And then eventually, once the mites establish a strong enough population, they will start creating webs, which is why they're called spider mites. Those webs will envelop the plant, the flowers, the leaves, and they will suck all the life out of your plants and eventually kill your plants and render them unsmokable. So spider mites are bad. So once you've identified that you have spider mites, then you can create a treatment protocol. The treatment protocol for spider mites is to use, one treatment protocol for spider mites is to use neem. It's a neem oil is it's the extract from an oily tree from India that has strong insecticidal and insect repellent properties. It also has a compound that disrupts the reproductive cycle of the two-spotted spider mite. So what you do is you mix up some neem as directed on the bottle. You'll use a surfactant, soap. You'll just add a little bit of soap in order to make the oil and water mix, because oil and water don't mix. So a little bit of soap, again, as directed by the product, and you'll spray it on your plants, the top, the underside, and you'll repeat this for 3-day intervals for 3 sessions. So every 3 days for a total of 9 days, 3 treatments. And that should get rid of your spider mites. You do this with the lights off. If you do it when the light's on, the light shining on the spray will burn your plant leaves. So you do it with the lights off. It should substantially enough disrupt, not only kill the mites that are on there, but also disrupt the reproductive cycle of the survivors, which is, it's a 72-hour reproductive cycle. So the first one kills everybody that's like there. The second one kills all the eggs that just hatched, or that were about to hatch that somehow survived. And then the third one is for good measure, just in case you miss anyone. That should get rid of your spider mites. Spider mites are not the worst foe, but they're a common one. And if you don't know about the spider mites reproductive cycle, if you sprayed every 4 days, or you sprayed every 2 days or something, you wouldn't be able to kill them. So it's really important to find out which pest you have, because then you can really ensure that you're going to kill the pest and deal with the issue. Spider mites usually show up when the environment is too hot and dry. So usually by the time you have a spider mite infestation, it usually means you kind of did something wrong, or something's wrong in the environment and it's too hot and dry. Your plant was too close to a radiator is the most common way that happens in the DC area. So neem oil was an example I used. Soap is a very effective foliar spray to eliminate pests. My favorite is Dr. Bronner's peppermint soap. You only need a little bit of it. It's affordable, it's natural, organic, and ethically sourced, and it smells great. And also, peppermint oil is a deterrent for most pests. So you can buy neem meal, but neem meal is used as an amendment, and it can kind of suppress pests on the soil level, but for pest treatment, I would recommend an OMRI listed, approved for organic agriculture neem oil that you mix in with water. I don't know, neem meal, or pulverized meal, neem is used for soil. Another product I love to use for most pests is called the Amazing Dr. Zymes Eliminator. It is a enzyme brew made by some pot growing hippies in California that seems to me right now to be like the number one go-to thing. Again, it's OMRI listed, approved for organic use, 100% natural. It's really gentle on plants, unlike oil products like neem. It doesn't clog the stomata. It doesn't clog the little pores in the plant's leaves that help it breathe. So, the enzyme product is really good. I would recommend looking into that. And then there's biopesticides, which are microbes that are engineered or farmed to kill specific pests. So Grandivo is one, Regalia is another. Those are a little more expensive. Those are a little more like commercial, but they're organic and they're effective, and they work and they're safe. And nobody wants to spray their plants. No one wants to talk about pesticides or fungicides or anything like that. But the reality is, if you're growing in an environment like ours, especially, early on, pests are something you have to plan for. And instead of waiting till you see a pest and then trying to identify it and treat it, the best thing is to be preventative. Good environment, preventative spraying. So I recommend spraying one of these products once a week with the lights off. And if you're outdoors planting your cannabis or putting your cannabis in an environment where it's biodiverse, so flowers, herbs, vegetables, different plants other than cannabis, that's a preventative strategy as well, because it'll be a more balanced ecosystem, and one pest won't be able to have so much effect. And then indoors, I would recommend spraying preventatively once a week, rotating. Maybe you do neem this week. Next week, you're going to do just peppermint soap. Next week, you're going to do the Dr. Zymes Eliminator, and just keep on top of it. And if you spray every week preventatively, and you're thorough and you spray under the leaves, you should be able to prevent most pest issues. But this is not something I would skip. People don't like the idea of spraying their plants. It's I would say necessary. Unfortunately, it's just something you have to do. The best tool for this is a pump sprayer. You can buy a one gallon pump sprayer, even a half-gallon pump sprayer at Home Depot, or at the grow shop or any garden center. It's just like a plastic tank with a little pump. So you fill it up with your solution, shake it up to mix it all up, pump it up, and then there's like a little sprayer wand, and you just press the little trigger and you spray the plant, making sure to scoop underneath the leaves and then over top and then the surface of the soil. So you're going to do this in only in the vegetative stage. In flowering, it's not good to spray after the first 2 to 4 weeks of flowering, because unlike an apple or a banana, or unlike like an apple or a kiwi, you're not going to wash it before you eat it, or you're not going to wash it before you smoke it. So anything you spray on your plant is going to go in your lungs. So once the plant starts flowering, that's when you stop spraying. And that's why you want to get all your spraying in during the vegetative stage, because that's your only opportunity to do that. So if you prevent most pests and disease early on, don't let them establish a population, by the time you get to flower, you won't be dealing with many issues. So anyway, I know we've gone a little bit over. We've gone 1 minute over. That's all I got for you today. I'll stay and hang out for another few minutes if anyone wants to jump on with a question. But if you got to jump off, feel free. Our next class will be on harvest. So we're going to talk about deciding when your plants are mature and when and how to harvest them, dry them, cure them, store them, and then some ideas on what to do with, with your flower. So thank you so much, everybody. A couple.
I was just going to mention one awesome class. Thank you so much. I also want a reminder, we are recording these and we will send the recordings out to people, so you don't need to memorize everything. And you're okay with sharing the slides as well?
Oh yeah, I'll send you this one and the last one.
Okay, so we'll also make the slides available as well. But definitely, if anyone has any questions, definitely feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself. And thank you all so much.
I'll get to these first two questions from the chat for outdoor growing. 20 gallon is the maximum size. So I wouldn't say 20 gallon is the maximum. I would say 10 gallon is the minimum size for outdoor growing in this area. And then the maximum is, I would say, 30, 40 is probably about as big as you'll realistically be able to go. So anyway, 20 gallon is a great size. It's going to be a nice, big, heavy plant. You can use any strain you'd like for growing outdoors in DC. You'll want to look at strains that have some resistance to humidity and mold because of our heavy summer rains. So, maybe not anything that is super dense or designed for indoor cultivation. Stuff like a Girl Scout cookies is not a good candidate for growing outside here because that strain is bred for indoor growing and has these like really dense nugs that are kind of fragile. So you'll want to look at a few, maybe some other strains. Delay flipping until all pests are eliminated. Yes, do not flip your plant into flower if you have like a pest problem, because it's only going to get worse. It's sometimes it can be a very hard decision because you're like, dang, if I don't flip now, this plant's going to get root bound, or, I'm trying to keep on schedule. But I would say, before you flip, if you take that opportunity to come in hard and get rid of those pests and then flip afterward. Okay, 20 gallon is maximum container size due to other constraints. Yeah, so if 20 gallon is your maximum size, I mean, you can grow pretty much anything in that size container. That's too big for an autoflower. So grow a photoperiod plant, right? A regular plant. You would probably want to look at a hybrid, something that the breeder says is good for growing outdoors. If you have an opportunity to look for pest or mold resistance, I would recommend that as well. Yeah. Thank you so much for all the good feedback. I appreciate all the love I'm getting. This is my first time doing this.